The bad memory explanation is generally the first explanation that people will think of. It's definitely psychologically the easiest explanation to accept. Basically, how it will occur is usually someone from the ME community will say, look, I remember Forrest Gump saying life is like a box of chocolates, rather than him saying life was like a box of chocolates. And you'd say a lot of other people remember that as well. Somebody promoting the bad memory explanation will say, well, look, if you watch through the video, his mom says life is like a box of chocolates. Forrest Gump says life was like a box of chocolates. People are merely conflating the two, merely having a distorted memory. That explains what's occurring. Totally simple explanation. People certainly can and do make mistakes with regards to their memory. People are actually in jail because of mistakes that have been made with regards to people's memory. Regarding the Mandela effect, the bad or distorted memory argument is insufficient. In this context, I want to deal with two objections. These objections are placed against basically all the other explanations in favor of the bad memory explanation. And I think if I can take away those explanations, it'll open people up to the possibility of considering the other explanations. Then I would also want to give two reasons for why the bad or distorted memory argument should be considered insufficient when it comes to suggesting that it is a good explanation for what we think of as the Mandela effect. People who accept the bad memory explanation usually do so in a context that believes that this is the only possible explanation, the only explanation that fits in the realm of actual possibilities. So they would look at all these other possible explanations and they would conclude that none of those explanations are possible, but the bad memory one is possible, so that must be the actual explanation. This idea was actually represented by the very beautiful Scully in an episode of X-Files.
They can't. I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. I mean, the Mandela effect is simply...
The Mandela effect
is simply people misremembering stuff.
To answer this objection, I would merely suggest that you consider that your view of science, that your view of religion might be limited. If you can accept the idea that your views might be limited, then you should consider yourself willing to consider alternate explanations for the evidence. In other words, that you shouldn't limit yourself to only considering that one possible explanation. I can give you two very good examples to illustrate how this mindset works. In the past, when people had first suggested the idea that the Earth was round, as they pictured, if it's a globe, the people standing on the top, that makes sense, but the people on the bottom, they'd just be falling off. So they thought it was impossible that the Earth was round. It just didn't make logical sense within the realm of their conception, their limited conception of science. But if they would have considered that, well, maybe their conception of science was limited, they would have been more open to the possibility of other explanations such as the Earth being round. The other objection is simply people's tendency towards going for the simple, or what seems to be the obvious answer to the question.
Guys, it's faulty memory because Occam's razor.
That's Ozzy's razor, not Occam's. It's always been Ozzy's razor.
Maybe in a parallel universe it is, but in still yet another universe it's perhaps known as Occam's axe.
It's not parallel universes!
They would conclude that the bad memory explanation is a simple and obvious explanation. Therefore, we shouldn't consider the other explanations. I would just remind you that in the past, for most of the world's history, people thought that the sun revolved around the Earth because every day when you go outside, it looks like the sun travels across the sky and you don't see the Earth moving at all. The simple and obvious explanation was that they thought that it was the sun moving, not that the Earth was moving. Careful observation of the planets showed something called retrograde motion this was puzzling. People were trying to figure out, why do we seem to be observing this? Copernicus brilliantly came up with the idea that it was actually the sun still, Earth traveling around the sun, and that could explain the retrograde motion. This led towards the wide adoption of the heliocentric model, even though it wasn't the simple and obvious explanation. I would consider that there are two main reasons to consider the bad memory argument is insufficient when it comes to explaining the entirety of the Mandela effect. The first reason has to do with the degree of unity with regards to the alternate memories. And I want to break this apart. Memory is something we rely on all the time. Work, when we're chatting with friends, when we're recalling stories about what had occurred, when we're talking to people about TV shows. With regards to evidence, people have done all kinds of studies trying to think through and determine the accuracy of people's memories. A TV station did an interesting experiment, and that's the one that I want to use as a comparative. They took basically a college classroom, an experiment set up by a criminology professor. They used a police officer and another man who would pretend to be a perpetrator.
We put a group of college students to the test. Helping us is former Spokane County Sheriff and current EWU criminal justice professor John Goldman. Playing the role of our bad guy is EWU police cadet Cale Hammond. And our victims in this scenario are a group of unsuspecting college students. They will be interviewed by EWU police detective Quincy Burns. 10 minutes after class starts.
Hey, John, we need to talk about this. No, we don't have time. No. We're going to take care of this.
So basically what they did was they had the man who's pretending to be a perpetrator of sorts come into the classroom, very angrily start yelling at the professor, and then leave the classroom. None of the students were expecting this to occur. Afterwards, the police officer interviewed the students and they were trying to see if the police officer could piece together what had actually happened with regards to description and with regards to what the man had said in the class. They found that they were able to put together a good picture of what he looked like and of what he had said. There was some information that was missing, but the information was very helpful. As an example, in order to explain why this degree of accuracy did actually happen to exist, when we do have a situation where we have multiple witnesses, I would simply say that what happens is when we have multiple witnesses, we will have a degree of unity regarding the things that actually did happen, whereas mistakes and inaccuracies will be widely varied, so that people can look through the information, see where there is a degree of unity, and compare that to all the individual isolated mistakes, because the mistakes can be made in a wide variety of ways. For example, one of the women said that he said, "You will be sorry, I will find you," which is exactly what the perpetrator had said.
Came in here very distraught, mentioned that he was going to fail the class.
He said, "You'll be sorry, I will find you."
He seemed very upset about a grade that Goldman had given him.
All that is true.
Now, if we had in a situation like this, we had a few people who said, he said, "You will be sorry, I will find you." And then some others that said, "You'll be sorry," or "I will find you," like parts of that statement, but not all of it. Then a bunch of other people who just didn't remember anything about that conversation at all. And then you had a few other people who said variations, but that were significantly different, like "I'm going to get you," or "I'm going to track you down," or things like that. We would expect that those types of errors, that the chances of there being more people that made the exact same error than the amount of people who had the correct memory, just the logical possibility of that is just incomprehensible, really. So based on what did occur, that they discovered that they believed that they could put together an accurate, or that the students did in fact put together an accurate description. So I want to compare this to the ME community. So when I'm looking at trying to see what people remember, I'll try to, and this can be just entertaining conversation. You can just throw these ideas out to people. You can say, well, what do you remember is the famous quote by Darth Vader from the original Star Wars? What's the famous thing that he said? Or what do you remember was Mr. Rogers' song about the neighborhood that he would sing at the beginning of his TV show? Or what do you remember the evil queen in Snow White saying,
"Who is the fairest one of all?"
Without giving any suggestions as to what people will remember, I just in regular conversations will ask people these questions. You can also, as a comparison, ask people questions regarding, what do you remember the famous line from the Terminator, in the original Terminator movie? Or what do you remember is the first rule of Fight Club? Or other entertaining, interesting quotes in subjects that are not controversial, in order to get an idea of a comparison. So there's been several different polls done. One was actually done by a scientist. I want to just give you one example by another person who just was done on Facebook. He asked people, what do you remember Darth Vader saying? Do you remember him saying, "No, I am your father," or "Luke, I am your father"? Or do you not remember, or do you remember something else other than those two choices?
Darth Vader, what did he say in Star Wars? "Luke, I am your father," or "No, I am your father." Maybe this guy has something to say about it.
Well, that said, "Luke, I am your father." I said to myself, he's lying. I wonder how they're going to play that lie out. Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me enough. He told me you killed him. No, I am your father. Say what?
59% of people in this poll remembered him as saying, "Luke, I am your father." And only 19% remembered it as, "No, I am your father." The other people were unsure. But if you look at even old VCR copies right now, what you'll find is him saying, "No, I am your father." A scientist, Blair Reach, did a survey which was repeated, which 25,000 people responded to.
So the real line is, "No, I am your father," but just about everybody and their mother remember 77% of them say, "No, he included the word Luke that was in there."
And he asked two questions that were not debated as Mandela effects in order to use them as a comparison. One of them was, do you remember the title Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Buffy a Vampire Slayer, or Buffy Vampire Slayer?
So let's look at the first one. It was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. With Buffy, I had 22,402 people answer this question. 96.7 of them chose what I'm calling the correct answer, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's no Mandela effect here, so there's no question whether it was the A or Buffy Vampire Slayer. It's just Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's the only one that you could have chosen to actually get this right, and there's no Mandela effect. So 96.7% of everybody got this right. And then I also asked that question, how confident are you? When you get up into the extremely confident people, you do see an increase. 98.8% of people were able to go get this one correct, that were extremely confident. So that tells me, people's memories don't really suck. Like, Buffy the Vampire Slayer versus Buffy a Vampire Slayer. That sounds pretty similar. Buffy Vampire Slayer, that sounds pretty similar. So just from a sound or just from like a memory thing, these ones are all close enough that somebody should be able to forget them or just confuse them or something. But they don't. They get it 98.8% correct. So this is one of the ways that I know, okay, the memory of these folks that are taking this are actually pretty good. Only 1.2% got that thing wrong. So this is what that looks like graphically. Almost everybody gets this one correct. There's a small group that got it wrong, but I'm pretty happy about that result.
Now, certainly this example was not nearly as well known as the example from Darth Vader. and were as well known as the other examples that I'm going to be discussing. But he gave this as a comparison for dealing with something that is not considered or not debated as a Mandela effect.
This one you're going to get right. There's no way that 94% of you are going to get this one wrong. Mirror, mirror on the wall. I mean, it's not magic. It's not magic, mirror.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest one of all?
In this poll, when it was asked, do you remember the evil queen saying, magic mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Or do you remember mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? 93% said that they remembered mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. I like to ask people what they remember Mr. Rogers singing at the beginning of his show.
I'm about to ruin your childhood here, and I apologize. The 80s show, Mr. Rogers song. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, right? So, I even tried to put the correct answer first. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood. Apparently not my neighborhood or your neighborhood, this neighborhood.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood.
What the?
So I would say that if it is true that Mr. Rogers had always sang, it's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, if it's true that Darth Vader had always said, no, I am your father, if it is true that the evil queen had always said, magic mirror on the wall, then most people's memories should coincide with those phrases, just like they do with all the other phrases that are not controversial, like I'll be back, or like the first rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. People should definitely not be surprised and shocked and be thinking that I definitely remember it the other way. Here we have tremendous amounts of people that remember things being the other way. Why is there this category of things, like the capital of Australia, lots of other things, where people confidently remember things being the other way and are really confused by the idea that things are no longer that way? Some will object and say things like, in the original Grimm's fairy tale, it says mirror, mirror on the wall. Therefore, we can look at that as an explanation for where this whole idea has come from. But I would simply say that the Disney movie was far more influential and far more popular than the original Grimm's fairy tale. And they also made books based on the Disney movie, which correspond, again, to what the current phrase is, magic mirror on the wall. Those Disney books would have been much more well known than the original Grimm's fairy tale. Therefore, I would simply say that the existence of that in the original Grimm's fairy tale is not nearly sufficient to explain the degree of the alternate memories that exist and the confidence that people have in those alternate memories. So to me, it simply seems that when we consider all of these things, that the better explanation is something more than the bad memory explanation. That is a possible explanation, but to me it's a weak explanation, that it's comparatively weak to the other explanations. The other thing that we can consider is what we would call reality residue. Those are things which seem to correspond to the alternate memories that people in any community have, but which don't correspond to how things seem to be now. For example, with regards to the phrase by Darth Vader, we have interviews with James Earl Jones where he speaks of reading Luke, I am your father in the script, or where he's talking about things and talks about a joke. He says, Luke, I am your father in the context of the joke, where the whole idea of the Mandela effect isn't being discussed. He's just referencing what occurred. but that description seems to correlate to the alternate memories. The domain name Looney Tunes with the alternate spelling was actually registered as a domain name years before the other spelling was, which these types of things just give evidence, and there are a lot of them, that there's a glitch, that something strange is happening. The strongest evidence for me relates to Ed McMahon. I'm not going to get into that now. You can look into this now on your own. But I would say that the various residual bits and pieces of information give credence to the idea that it's more than just people having a poor memory. I want to briefly discuss the consequences and implications of the different possible conclusions with regards to what is occurring behind the Mandela effect. First of all, I would say that a possible consequence of looking into this is finding out the truth of the matter, which is, truth is something that a lot of us want to find and we're passionate about it. But I would say that knowing the truth in this case actually doesn't matter as far as I can tell. My conclusion, we'll discuss this more as we go along, is that most of us cannot affect at all what is occurring. Perhaps the people connected to CERN and connected to artificial intelligence can, but most of the general public can't. So really, it personally doesn't have any significant consequences. I think it's important to recognize that you can make a difference. I am so incredibly thankful for the world that we live in the sense that if it wasn't for that, my daughter would not be alive. I would not be able to enjoy my daughter's life right now. She still has a lot of medical issues, but if it wasn't for the medical system that we have, she wouldn't even be alive at all. So there's been wonderful doctors. There's been some doctors that have been frustrating, but there's been some wonderful doctors that have encountered that have made a significant impact on her life. We can think of the whole political system as providing a situation where those doctors are funded and where I, as just an average citizen, have access to that medical help. We can look at all the different people who are working, who are paying taxes in the world as contributing to the economy, creating a situation where I've had access to that, where I can still enjoy my daughter being in my life right now. That is tremendously wonderful. I think we should do whatever things we can do to have an impact on the happiness of the people that are around us, and consider that we might be just playing a very small role. One of my daughter's friends, there's a single mom, 2 sons, they're both around something like 20. These 3 people were just sharing one computer. I was able to give them a laptop, so at least they have, only recently the one son had actually got his own phone, very poor. I can feel good about doing some small thing to help contribute to those people's happiness. Another thing I did was learn how to dance. I learned how to dance salsa, bachata, kizomba. At first it was mainly trying to, a way to meet women, which I think is fine in itself and a good thing. But I've come to really enjoy it and come to feel that I'm contributing to people's happiness in the context of being involved in this community. I would just encourage you to find out what you can do in the midst of the world around you that'll have some significance, that'll create some amount of happiness. And don't think about big things. Don't worry about big things. St. Teresa said, most of us can't do great things, big things, but we can do little things with great love.